All right. Good morning or afternoon, whatever time you're watching this, guys. This is Mr. Larson. We're working on Springboard Activity 1.5 today. So in 1.5, remember, we're still doing a narrative study, and we're going to be working today on making inferences. And with those inferences, remember, an inference is an educated guess based on textual evidence. So we're going to work on inferences and finding those textual evidence pieces that are going to help support our inferences. We're also going to focus a little bit on point of view of the characters, and we're going to have a little bit of practice at the very end on conventions of pronouns and dialogue. And remember, pronouns are the nouns that replace, they're words that replace nouns. So instead of saying Bill, you can say he or him or I or we or us. Those are all pronouns. And dialogue is people speaking. So as you read the story, I wish we could read this one together. This is one of my favorites. This is an excerpt, which means a novel excerpt, which means there is an entire book called Flipped by Wendell Van Dranen. So if you like this is like the first chapter of that book. So if you like it, there's a book, and I think there's even a movie from this that is pretty good. Okay, so as you read, here's what it wants you to do. As authors develop their characters in various ways, when looking for evidence of characterization, so characterization, that's a big fancy word. That means the way that the author lets you know what their characters are like. Okay, so if you have, how do you get to know a character? Through the description of how they look, what others say about them, and what they do. Okay, so if you have a bad guy, how do you know he's a bad guy? Okay, you know he's a bad guy by the things that he says and the things that he does and what others say about him. So those are the three things we're going to be looking at that make characterization. Okay, so as you find anything, there's two main characters in this story, Bryce and Julie. Okay, so as you go through, remember you can use this highlight tool up here. As you go through the story, highlight things that help you understand what that character is like. Because the authors don't usually come out and say, Bryce is a nice young boy who is 10 years old and his favorite colors. Right? It doesn't usually come out and say all those things. They show you rather than just tell you. And that's part of the fun of reading, is getting to know those characters. Okay, so you'll notice there's the story. So remember, as you're going through, let's say you find a piece of dialogue, and you could just click on the highlight, and you can just highlight it right there. Okay, so that's a pretty cool feature. So make sure you're using that. It's even easier than underlining in your book if we had this in paper pencil. Okay, so the way this is set up, this is the same story told from two different perspectives. So the first, you get the glimpse of from Bryce, and you get the story from Julie's perspective. It's the same section of time, but from their points of view, which you'll see the way that they retell the story is quite different from each other. Okay, so after you read it, there's going to be obviously some ways for you to think about things. And it says, number one, analyze the first meeting between Julie and Bryce. From Bryce's point of view, use details from the story to describe what Bryce says and does. Okay, so the first part, you're going to go back and look for details of what Bryce says about Julie. Okay, number two, and you're going to type them in here. After reading Bryce's first-person telling of this incident, find the part of Julie's story that recounts the exact part of the incident. Mark the text by highlighting words and phrases in Julie's retelling of the incident that show her attitude toward and her feelings about what is happening. Okay, so you'll notice after you read the story that the way that they remember that story and retell that part of their lives is quite different. Number three, how does the author pace the narrative? Pace means at the speed that they're going and how fast they get to details, and so what do they do to build that world that you're living in? Because this is the beginning of the book. What words or phrases does the author use as transitions? Transition words, if you forgot what those are words that connect and move from one part of the story to another. Next, also, then, and all of a sudden. Those things are all transition words. So try and find a couple of those and write those in there. Number four, how does the author's use of different chapters represent each character contribute to the development of the plot and the different perspectives of the characters? So this is a unique craft and structure. A lot of times what we're going to do, we're going to be looking at professional authors and see what they do to make a good story. So hopefully we can pick up some of those tips and tricks and put them in our own writing. Okay, so what does the author do to help develop the plot and show those different perspectives? Number 5, okay, a writer's diction or word choice often uses connotation. Okay, here's a fancy word. Okay, so there's a dictionary definition over here. Connotation refers to the suggested or implied meaning or emotion associated with the word. In contrast, denotation refers to the literal meaning of a word. So the way I like to remember these is denotation starts with a D, and that is the dictionary definition. Connotation is the meaning behind those words. Okay, so if the verbs like barged or shoved or wedged, okay, so if you say somebody ran up to you and wedged their way between you, that has a different image behind it, right? This person's kind of forceful and pushing their way and doesn't care what anybody else thinks, as opposed to this person came up and walked between me and my sibling. Okay, that's a little bit different. That would have a different meaning or connotation behind it. We'll come back to denotation and connotation. They might be words you've never heard of, but you understand them in context because we do it all the time. All right. It says record the textual evidence of the author's characterization in the following graphic organizer. So you're going to write things that Bryce and Julie says, things that they do. Obviously, you don't have to put everything in here. So a couple of things that they say, don't record every piece of dialogue. A couple of things that they do. A couple of things that other people say about Bryce and Julie. That could be what they say about each other, or there are other characters in the book. There's a mom and there's a dad, there's a sister that say things about them. So what do others say about them? And any description of what they look like. Okay, so their appearance. There is some good descriptions, especially of Julie, in the story. Okay, then with number 7, you're going to fill in the blanks. Make an inference, remember that's an educated guess, about the character's attitudes and flipped. To support your thinking, include textual evidence about what the characters say and do. I know Bryce thinks Julie is, and then a word to describe, an adjective to describe Julie, because he says, and then textual evidence to support it. So you can't say that Bryce thinks Julie is silly, because there's nothing in the story to support that she's silly. You're going to do the same thing about what Bryce thinks, or what Julie thinks about Bryce. Okay, and then you're going to think of, there's going to be a couple main events in the story that you're going to retell from how Bryce sees it and how Julie sees it. I would recommend, this is kind of giving away, there's a part where they hold hands. And how Bryce sees that holding hands and how Julie sees holding hands is very different. So I would focus on that one. That's the easiest one. I'll give you that hint. Okay, so how they describe the incident, the thing that happened, and how they both respond to the incident, because they respond very differently. Okay, and the last part, we still got another page. We have some, it says, writers use pronouns to replace nouns in a text and in order to avoid excess repetition. Consider in the following examples. Okay, so this is without pronouns. Julie sees Julie's neighbor every day. Julie says it makes Julie happy. If you wrote that way, people would think you were a robot or crazy, so you need to make sure we automatically in our lives use pronouns. Okay, so Julie sees her neighbor every day. She says it makes her happy. So those pronouns would be her, she, and her again. Okay, so here's a list of different types of pronouns. Subjective, objective, and possessive. So it gives you a list. Okay, so down here it wants you to practice. It says first person, paragraph 20, and for the first time in my life, I had that feeling. Okay, so here's a second person. So they give you some different examples. And for practice, it says for each type of pronoun, so choose one from each one of these lists, subjective, objective, and possessive. Identify an example in the selection. So go back and try and find where they use one of these pronouns and write that sentence down here. And then try and write your own sentence using that type of pronoun. Okay, so you got some room down here to write a couple sentences using those pronouns. And then it wants you to think of a time. It says collaborative discussions, so unfortunately we're not going to be with the neighbor. We might do maybe breakout sessions or something to talk about this. That would be kind of fun. We'll see how that works. Describe a time when you and another person, a friend, an adult, a teacher, a sibling, saw the same incident differently. Usually kids choose between them and a sibling because what you say happened and what your brother or sister say happened obviously sometimes is different. Okay, so you would describe an incident and you would say who this, my brother, who's saying the opposite side. So I say I was just walking along and accidentally bumped my brother, and he says I ran up and pushed him on the ground and kicked dirt in his face. Okay, so those are quite different. Okay, so what did you learn? How did you grow? And what would this person say about you? Okay, and then once again, we'll talk about the narrative prompt together, so don't worry about that. All right, that was a long one. They are not usually this long, so hopefully we'll make it through this assignment. It's a good story. Hope you enjoy it. Thanks, guys.